October 2nd, 1974, Holladay, Utah. A quiet suburban neighborhood where life seemed simple, safe, and ordinary. On this autumn afternoon, a bright 16-year-old cheerleader left her home on what seemed like the smallest of errands, just to buy a pack of gum. She promised she would be right back, but she never returned. Her name was Nancy Wilcox. To those who knew her, she was full of life, laughter, and promise. But to history, her name became tragically tied to one of the darkest figures America has ever known. For nearly 15 years, her disappearance remained a haunting mystery. Her family forced to live without answers. And even when a confession finally came, it came from the lips of a man whose life was built on lies, manipulation, and cruelty. Nancy's fate was revealed, but her story, like so many of Ted Bundy's victims, was left clouded in contradictions. This is the tragic case of Nancy Wilcox, the first Utah victim of Ted Bundy. A story of innocence stolen, of a family shattered, and of questions that, even after decades, still linger. Nancy Wilcox was a sophomore at Olympus High School in 1974. She was the kind of teenager people remembered instantly, cheerful, bright, and always smiling. Friends described her as someone who could lift spirits just by being in the room. She was a cheerleader, she was popular, and she was known for her kind and genuine personality. To her family, she was a daughter and a sister who brought energy into their home. That fall afternoon in Holladay, Utah, Nancy told her mother she was stepping out for a short errand, just a quick trip to get some gum. It was the kind of everyday task no one would ever think twice about. She carried a little money with her and promised she would be back soon. But those were the last words her family ever heard from her. When hours passed and Nancy hadn't come home, her parents grew uneasy. They began making calls, checking with friends, trying to retrace her steps. By nightfall, dread set in. Something was wrong. Nancy wasn't the kind of teenager to disappear without explanation. Parents reported her missing, expecting that the police would launch an immediate search. But in the mid-1970s, the disappearance of teenagers was often brushed aside. Law enforcement officers frequently labeled missing teens as runaways, assuming they had left home by choice and would eventually return. And that's exactly how authorities initially treated Nancy's case. To them, it looked like another runaway situation. To her parents, it was unthinkable. Nancy was responsible, dependable, and deeply connected to her family. They knew she hadn't simply decided to vanish. Something had happened, but without evidence and with police slow to act, Nancy's disappearance quickly slipped into silence. Another open case file in a growing stack. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, Nancy's case became part of a larger, more terrifying pattern that was unfolding across Utah. Other young women were disappearing, and the similarities between the cases were too striking to ignore. Throughout late 1974, Utah communities were shaken by a wave of vanishings. Young women were last seen walking alone, leaving school, heading home from shopping, or just stepping out briefly like Nancy had. Witnesses began reporting a strange detail. Many of the missing women were last seen near a Volkswagen Beetle. The driver, described as a charming, clean-cut man, seemed friendly, approachable. He knew how to win trust, even in brief encounters. But once inside that car, the women were never seen alive again. Families lived in fear. Parents warned their daughters not to walk alone, not to accept rides from strangers, not even to step out without telling someone where they were going. The state of Utah was holding its breath, waiting for answers. At the time, no one knew the true scope of what was happening. The man behind these disappearances was not just any predator. He was Theodore Robert Bundy, Ted Bundy, a law student, intelligent and articulate, who on the surface seemed like the last person who could commit such horrific crimes. But in reality, he was building a trail of victims that stretched across multiple states. For Nancy Wilcox, this meant her case was quickly swallowed up in a terrifying pattern. What had started as one missing girl in Holladay soon became part of a larger nightmare, a string of cases that law enforcement was only beginning to connect. To Nancy's family, though, she wasn't just another statistic. She was their daughter. And the silence surrounding her disappearance was deafening. For over 15 years, Nancy's disappearance remained unsolved. Her family lived in torment, forced to carry the pain of not knowing. It wasn't until 1989, just days before his execution, that a confession finally came. Ted Bundy, who had spent years denying many of his crimes, finally began to speak. Facing his final days on death row, Bundy opened up to investigators in a series of chilling interviews. His motives were complex. Some believe he hoped to delay his execution by offering information. Others think he simply wanted to exert control one last time. Whatever the reason, Bundy started to talk. In those final conversations, Bundy admitted that Nancy Wilcox was his very first victim in Utah. He said he abducted her near her neighborhood in Holladay, taking her back to his apartment. He claimed that he kept her alive overnight before strangling her the following day. But his details were vague, inconsistent, and sometimes contradictory. Bundy told investigators that he left Nancy's body near Fairview or Spanish Fork, remote areas in central Utah. At other times, he mentioned the desolate Noton area, hundreds of miles away, a barren stretch of desert where remains could easily vanish forever. For detectives, this was both a breakthrough and a frustration. Bundy had confirmed what Nancy's family had long feared, that she had been murdered. But his refusal, or perhaps his inability, to give clear details meant her remains could not be found. To the very end, Bundy remained manipulative, cruel, and elusive. For Nancy's parents, the confession was devastating. They finally knew what had happened to their daughter, but they also understood that Bundy's words could never be fully trusted. Even in death, he held power over his victims' families by withholding the truth. Following Bundy's execution in January 1989, search teams fanned out across Utah, desperate to find Nancy's remains. Investigators, volunteers, and local sheriffs combed through deserts, forests, and rural backroads. The terrain was vast, the clues were few, and Bundy's contradictory accounts made the search nearly impossible. Later that year, fragments of human bones were discovered, a shoulder blade, pieces of a blouse. For a moment, there was hope. Could these be Nancy's? Had she finally been found after nearly 2 decades of searching? But the science of the 1980s was limited. Forensic technology couldn't provide a definitive answer. The bones were too degraded, the evidence too fragile. Testing came back inconclusive, and so, even in death, Nancy's fate remained unresolved. Detectives admitted openly that Bundy often lied about his victims' locations, Sometimes he buried bodies, other times he left them exposed. In chilling detail, he confessed to revisiting the remains of some victims, returning to scenes of horror only he understood. For Nancy's family, the search was another wave of heartbreak. They had endured years of silence, years of waiting. Bundy's confession had given them a grim truth, but not the closure they longed for. The possibility that Nancy's remains had been found only to remain unidentified was almost too painful to bear. Their daughter's final resting place was lost in uncertainty, swallowed by Bundy's cruelty and the vast, unforgiving landscapes of Utah. In 1990, the Wilcox family gathered to do what no family should ever have to do. They held a memorial service for Nancy without her body. At Wasatch Lawn Memorial Park, they placed flowers by a simple gravestone, standing over a symbolic marker instead of a casket. It was the closest thing they could have to closure, though closure never truly came. At that service, Nancy's father, Herbert Wilcox, delivered a speech that captured both the heartbreak and the hope of a grieving parent. He said, "Her earthly tabernacle is known only to her heavenly Father, but wherever she lies, I am sure it is a sacred spot. Someday we will be with Nancy again." For 16 years, Nancy's parents had prayed for answers, and even when those answers came, they brought no peace. Instead, they faced the crushing reality that their daughter was gone forever, and they would never know exactly where she lay. The grief didn't stop with Nancy. Just months after her disappearance, her older brother David passed away from kidney disease. The Wilcox family was forced to bear not only the loss of a daughter, but also the loss of a son in the very same year. It was almost unimaginable, 2 children gone in such quick succession. For the Wilcox family, grief was not a chapter, it was a lifelong companion. They remembered Nancy not for the horror of her end, but for the joy she brought into their lives. Friends remembered her laugh, her energy, her innocence. She was more than a victim. She was a girl with dreams and a bright future, stolen in the most horrific way. Now, more than 50 years later, Nancy Wilcox's remains have never been recovered. Her case is still officially open in missing persons databases, but even there, errors exist. Wrong dates, incorrect clothing descriptions, clerical mistakes that reduce her story to a flawed record. Bundy's confession gave a partial truth, but not the whole truth. Some believe he deliberately misled investigators about Nancy's burial site, keeping her story shrouded in mystery even after his death. Others believe that after years of hiding his crimes, Bundy himself no longer remembered the exact places where he left his victims. What we know is this: Nancy Wilcox was more than just another statistic. She was more than a footnote in Bundy's long trail of victims. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend. She was 16 years old with a life ahead of her that was brutally cut short. And while Ted Bundy will always be remembered as one of the most infamous killers in history, it is Nancy's name that deserves to be spoken. Nancy's story that deserves to be told. She was more than his victim. She was Nancy. If you found Nancy's story important, please like, share, and subscribe for more untold cases. Because behind every crime, there is a victim who must never be forgotten.